Yeah, let's go for it. I think I've got all the books. I've got my notes.
Recording in progress.
Oh.
Right. Oh, hang on. No, hang on.
Recording stopped.
Sorry. I'll do that again because I just realised, of course, if it doesn't edit, it has to be really tight, right? So as soon as you okay it, we'll go.
Okay.
If you see what I mean. So
yeah. And is it set to whatever mode you need it
speaker,
to be in?
yeah, it is, yeah.
It is,
Yeah.
all right.
So are you ready?
I'm good, yeah.
Okay. Right, let's do that again then. Give me the thumbs up after you've okayed it.
Sure.
Recording in progress.
I don't have to because I've already said yes. So stop it again.
Ah, right.
So now, because I've okayed it, it will allow
Recording
you to stop.
stopped.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
All
Okay then. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I feel like Bob Dylan. Okay. You may speak now, Nick.
Hello, and welcome to Literary as Feck. Today we're talking about Michael Moorcock. Not to be confused with that poor fella from Skibbereen, Michael Lescock, whose career in the dirty films was as unenthusiastically received as his own wee Mickey was by the ladies. End scene.
Nice.
All right.
Nice. I'll be doing the rest of the show as Bob Dylan, which won't be annoying at all.
No, but it might fit with the overall slight annoyingness of the books we're talking about today and the time period that they're set in.
Michael Lescock, how much time did you spend on that one?
Oh, an entire week I did writing that piece.
You had a few script meetings, some people flown in.
Oh yes. There was some rewrites, but yeah, this one is funny because like sometimes it's my choice or it's your choice, but in this case we both independently had bought some of the Cornelius Quartet books, and then we were just talking about like what are we going to do soon, and then either you said or I said, well, I've got this, and then so I feel like this was a choice of both of us rather than maybe of one of us. Right,
which is a perfect example of why things shouldn't be chosen by committee, because they turn out to be shit.
And it's also nice that we have 4 books, and I have read 2 of them, and you have read, how many of them have you read?
Combined, 2 of them as well, probably. But that's one whole one, and like a third each of the other ones skipping around at random to preserve my mental health, and so I didn't punch a hole in the wall or murder the cats. Or
funnily enough, it does say at the beginning of this, because I've got them in like separate volumes. You have them in one big.
I do.
Gigantic.
It's over there, but even if I showed it, it is of a very boring generic cover, so it's not very interesting.
But it does say at the beginning, note to the reader, although these books may be read in any order, the reader might wish to know that the structure of the last volume reflects the structure of the overall tetralogy. So it basically admits right away that there's no overarching rhyme nor reason. And in fact, I would almost say the second one that I read, which is the 3rd book, I feel not only could I have read it out of sequence, I could have read the book in any order. I could have started at the back and read it to the front.
Right.
I could have just rolled a dice each time, like a choose your own adventure or like a fighting fantasy book, and just and it wouldn't have necessarily made my reading experience that different.
I feel the intro could also just be
Sure, yeah, that would work too. But maybe we should
well, I've got a potted I mean, you may want to add to it. I prepared a potted Michael Moorcock
please.
bio, if you like. Just very basic. So, born in 1939, Michael Moorcock, still knocking around. Very much a London centric kind of author, right? Born and bred, and most of his fiction is that isn't set on other worlds. Yeah, Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, and apparently I've never read it, but his book Mother London from 1988 is kind of considered his best book. Have you ever read Mother London?
No.
It sounds kind of interesting. It sounds, I don't know too much about it, but it sounds a little bit psychogeographical, maybe. And there's it's futures and pasts in London, and there's a lot of stuff about the Blitz and stuff which he grew up during. So that kind of, I mean, if I was going to read another Michael Moorcock book, I think that might be where I'd go next, because it might not be just a pile of kind of words at random. So yeah, knocked around for a while, and kind of amateur fanzines until he got the gig of editor in the late 50s for Tarzan Adventures magazine. So apparently that was his first kind of professional job, and he was writing for it as well. So a lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs pastiche pieces, which also ties into the one movie script that he wrote, right? Which was The Land That Time Forgot, the Amicus film, which I've never liked. I don't know where you stand on the Land That Time Forgot thing, but it is a very, you could argue it is actually a pretty good adaptation of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I think I'm not a big Edgar Rice Burroughs fan in general.
Yeah, I just, that's all Doug McClure in a cable knit sweater. That's all I remember. And are there 8 men in that one, or is that in the sequel? The People That Time Forgot.
I don't remember much about People. I remember Creatures is the kind of the prehistoric one, right? But I don't think that's got anything to do with Edgar Rice Burroughs.
But I do have a question. So did he, because I also was reading, or actually I think I was listening to an interview with him where he was talking about as a teenager working for Fleetway for comics, like writing writing the text stories that appeared in the annuals. Like this is at the age of 15 and 16.
Okay. Well, whatever bio I got this out of the Encyclopedia and Science Fiction and the John Clute and that other fellow one, but they didn't mention that, I have to admit.
Yeah, because he wrote for Lion, like a bunch of those kind of boys titles of that era.
Right. I'm wondering if there's a connection here. This might be massively unfair, but is there some sort of connection with people who write for comics early on making not very good fiction writers? Like, is there something that corrupts the process because what you're writing is accompanied by pictures, so you don't learn to complete it at an early age or something, and you learn this bad habit?
I actually think that we will get into all of this a little bit later, maybe, because I have some thoughts about where Michael Moorcock and maybe the people of his era stand in the whole history of science fiction, and I think it's the same place that maybe Alan Moore stands in the history of comic books, and that is with both feet planted firmly in adolescence. I feel like they are the adolescents of their respective genres.
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking of Alan Moore as well, just along the lines of, if you've ever tried to read any of his non-comic prose fiction, it's fucking hell. Like,
yes.
Whew, no, thank you. Yes, and I know what you mean. It does have that very
shocking,
cum-stained underpants kind of. I mean, I'm one to talk. I'm probably sitting in cum-stained underpants right now, but. Yeah, all right. See if I can regain whatever I was going to say. Aren't you?
I'm going to plead the fifth there. But yeah, so I think that... actually, I just had a shower, so no, I'm in a brand spanking fresh set of undies myself.
Good for you.
think about. But yeah, no, I do think that there's a kind of, it's the pendulum swing, right? They were a reaction against, I guess, what they saw as the boring, staid, kind of maybe conservative, science fiction and fantasy of the past. Certainly, Moorcock saw himself in opposition to C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who were coming out of a very Catholic kind of worldview. And then
he had a go at Lovecraft as well, didn't he, for his racism?
Yeah, for the racism, which fair enough. The racism in Lovecraft is problematic. And he certainly hated the gore novels intensely. I think John Norman is the guy who wrote those.
Ah, right.
Because he said that they should have been put in like brown paper bags and sold kind of under the counter because they were so odiously anti-feminist and kind of sex-laden.
Those covers were always a highlight of visiting the newsagents when I was a kid.
Although, funnily enough, the two movies totally missed the mark. The two movies based on those novels are completely bereft of any skin or anything other than maybe Jack Palance at his most confused and inebriated. There's nothing much in those two movies worth recommending.
Isn't Oliver Reed in one of them as well?
Oh, maybe. That would make sense.
Remember. Oh no, I'm thinking of maybe there's another series. Is it the Dragonard series? That were made by Canon in South Africa at the same time, which is kind of based on, again, kind of sketchy paperbacks with, which didn't necessarily promote female empowerment. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, I think Moorcock had this, but at the same time, funnily enough, like some of what he wrote is not particularly. If you take the long view, it doesn't seem all that great. There's a particularly grisly gang rape scene at the end of the third book that I was kind of like, oh, that seemed to come out of left field and kind of is visited on a character who, we have some sympathy for, and it seems not motivated by anything other than, a want to shock, and it's kind of a
Well, these things of this era, they always remind me a little bit of that kind of, thinking they're progressive, but in some ways quite retrograde. They remind me of like Neil the hippie and the Young Ones. Like he's all peace and love, but then he writes that poem about may your seed, in the belly of your woman find its,
Right, yes, yeah.
The one thing they never did quite get the handle on was kind of feminism and equality. Right? All those old hippies are actually quite sexist if you ever get a chance to hang out with them. They're like...
keep them barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen kind of attitudes.
Yeah. Right.
But anyway, so, I think maybe you can, if you want to finish up, but obviously New Worlds, I guess, was Moorcock's big contribution, right?
And again, I don't know much about, again, this is all stuff I pulled, and I'm very familiar with it in general, but I don't think I've ever read an issue of New World. I've not read any anthologies. I'm very aware of it though, because especially under his editorship, if that's a word, there was people like Brian Aldiss and J.G. Ballard and Samuel Delaney, Thomas Dish, Norman Spinrad, lots of people like that, and I don't know. I have no idea if that's their best work, or if that's where they got, like you said, that's where they got their start to kind of get their tantrums out, and then got better writers, or I've no idea. It might be the best work, because I don't know. I should really pick up, and we may even do it on here, you never know, like a best of, because there are best of New Worlds collections out there, which I'm guessing are probably a good place to start reading some of these authors, and a lot of them I'm not familiar with. I should be. They're names that have been floating around in my consciousness for years and years and years, but for whatever reason, I don't think I've ever read Norman Spinrad, for example. Or...
No, I don't think so either. And so the word that gets used or applied here is new wave, right?
Yes.
So the new wave science fiction.
Yeah.
And this is the flagship magazine, I guess, of that in England at least.
Yeah. So this is so from about like the mid '60s through to I think his run was early '70s or something, right? And on and off, and then New Worlds was about before and was after as well, but I think it's his run which is considered iconic, right?
Yeah.
And of course he wrote the Elric books kind of around the same time, which is more in sword and sorcery territory than SF, right? And then I suppose his other big, I actually looking it up, I was kind of surprised. I always assumed that the Jerry Cornelius books were not amongst his like biggest, most well known, but it seems after Elric actually they might be what he's most well known for.
Yeah, I would say that, and maybe Hawkmoon would be the other, probably, and Corum. Those are probably the big four Moorcock.
Right, and I suppose the other thing we should mention as well is his lyric writing duty for Hawkwind.
Yes, yeah.
And Robert Calvert's solo as well, I think. Right, some stuff.
Yeah. And then also for the Blue Oyster Cult. He wrote Veteran of the Psychic Wars, which is a great song.
Okay.
And then I think also there's this, I don't know if he wrote it or if it's just based on his, but there's also a song called Black Blade, which is based on Elric that the Oyster Cult did.
Okay.
And then I think, he had his own band.
Yes.
Michael Moorcock and the Deep Fix.
Yes. Which I've not
I
heard.
do have, for some reason I've had for years. And it's all right. It's the interstitial conversational bits that kind of, they're so of the time, and a lot of English guys use the word dude. Hey dude, it just rings really awkward in my ear.
That's a good point.
But the songs are fine.
Okay. I haven't listened to, because the thing with the Hawkwind is it works a bit better because I haven't listened to the Hawkwind album for a while, but from memory it's a lot more well integrated, so you could even kind of ignore the lyrics if you want to and just go with it. It's not like a bed of spacey noises with someone going, and then Gnoch Noch the Boo Boo went to the planet Naga, and it's not that. Right?
Yes, no, and actually, I would say, things like Sonic Attack or whatever it's called, which is one of his poems that they sort of set to music. They're good. They're some of his best writing, I suspect. Are those pieces he did with Hawkwind.
So just so that's kind of my bio more or less, just to give people a context. There's a lot more to it, but just for total beginners, even more than us who don't even know who Michael Moorcock is at all, and also just so we know. So from my point of view, I pretty much know. I know Hawkwind, Moorcock. I've read this quartet, and pretty much that's about it.
Okay.
But you have a bit more history with Michael Moorcock, right?
Yeah, over the years at different times, I did read, I think, most of the Elric books, or at least most of the early ones, like the initial run of Elric. And then I read the Hawkmoon books, which might be the ones I enjoyed the most out of all of them. I couldn't say why that is, but for some reason they're maybe more straight ahead, just science fiction adventure stories. They also prefigure, I think that Pat Mills borrowed a certain amount from the Hawkwind books. Basically, the kind of the idea of Nemesis the Warlock is kind of in there.
Okay.
With this kind of underground sort of. He makes it. It's like a future where the British Empire is basically, the bad guys and the Germans are the good guys, and the British Empire wear these kind of, it all looks very Thomas Torquemada, the Termites, that kind of stuff.
Right.
So yeah, it's certainly one that I enjoyed, although I haven't read it in forever. Also, the book that I had was dedicated to Ian Kilminster, who is better known to the world as Lemmy out of Motorhead.
Yeah.
And so I appreciated that Moorcock dedicated one of his books to Lemmy.
He was probably sat opposite him, somewhere in Ladbroke Grove. Lemmy's on the sofa and Michael Moorcock's there smoking a spliff, and I'm going to dedicate this to you, right? Dude, go for it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously they would have known each other through Hawkwind. And then, I noticed the Hawkwind shows up actually in the third one of these books, in not the condition. He's like the English assassin. They're all named. All the members of the band are named at a party at one point.
Right. So the other thing I that might be of interest, I don't know if you have anything to say about this, but I was looking around because I was kind of trying to make sense of what I'd attempted to read, and sometimes as well I kind of second guess myself as a reader and think, because some things are off-putting, not necessarily the easiest of reads, but if you persevere with them, they're very rewarding. I suppose the most famous example being something like Shakespeare, right? Like,
yes.
Shakespeare is not shit. When you first start trying to read Shakespeare and it's difficult, and you throw it away, that's something you should probably return to, rather the problems with you rather than with the writing, right? So sometimes maybe if I tried. So I went and I had a look about other user reviews and stuff, and one person who was a lot more familiar with Michael Moorcock than I was, they didn't necessarily say actually these books are brilliant, but they just said, well, if you are going to attempt them, what you might want to do first is read the very first run of... did Elric start as a series of short stories? Is that right? There's 9 short stories or something.
Yes.
And that kind of establishes... Because, as we'll probably get into, Michael Moorcock kind of rips himself off again and again and again, right? Basically tells the same... So apparently, because those first 9... Have you read the first 9 Elric stories?
Yes.
Okay, so you might be able to back this up as true or not. They're very, very, very straight, or relatively more straightforward sword and sorcery tales, which you can actually follow the plot. And apparently, if you read those 9 short stories and you get the shape of the whole thing with Elric and his sister and all that, apparently, if you have that framework and then jump into the Jerry Cornelius books, then you're not totally lost at sea. Does that make sense? Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think that there's kind of analogs for the characters and even certain scenes that I noticed showed up in both. So there's Ms. Brunner, who's a character that appears in most of the books, and she seems to be... Well, maybe should we talk maybe very briefly about what the plot of at least the first book is, and that way, then before we start making connections to other books.
Right. Yes, I've got Wikipedia open to help me. Well,
I mean, I think I can probably do the first one, not just because I read it recently, but also because I watched the movie.
Yes.
Which is surprisingly faithful adaptation of the book, which I was surprised by on a number of levels.
Quite good fun, isn't it, as well?
I liked it a lot. I liked it more than the book.
Yes,
I'll get to that in a moment. But basically, so Jerry Cornelius...
By the way, Nick, you don't weasel out of this. You don't, by jumping ahead to appear to take the bullet, I'll do the first one, and you can do the second one. No. I'm not falling for that. No one's doing the second, third, and fourth ones.
I'll touch on the third one because I also read it, but it's not something that you can explain plot because it doesn't have a plot in any meaningful sense.
Just so you don't think I don't see through your cunning plan.
That's fine. So, our main character is Jerry Cornelius, who is in the first book, a kind of a secret agent, super spy, but also a writer and a kind of a philosopher. And there's all this scientist, he's got all of these things going on. Kind of an even more hip James Bond, I guess, in some ways.
Or a proto Buckaroo Banzai, in so much as he's awesome at everything. Yes. There's that kind of thing going on.
Absolutely.
I think I wrote of in my review of the film. He also reminds me a little bit of Jason King, eccentric millionaire. If you remember the Jason King TV series, do you remember Jason King?
Yes.
As played by Peter Wingard, right, of Flash Gordon fame. Pathetic.
So Jerry becomes aware that entropy has set in and that the world is ending, basically. And he's approached by a group of these shadowy figures who want him to do a raid on his own childhood home. Because there's a piece of microfilm in there that somehow, again, the details kind of get lost, but I think is related to somebody who'd gone into deep space and come back and then recorded some message or something along those lines. But anyway, it's somehow important to this group of people to get this piece of microfilm out of his house because they built this supercomputer, which is called Duel or something like that, which the computer's job is going to be to download all of human knowledge into a collated, kind of come up with the answer to life, the universe, and everything, sort of, is the impression we're given, and then download it into a human brain. So this piece of microfilm was important. So there's a bunch of dodgy old guys, and then there's a woman called Miss Brunner, who, as the book goes on, seems to have some sort of vampiric ability to absorb other people, because at various other characters, she almost always has a sidekick who then mysteriously disappears. And the movie also makes this very clear as well that is what's going on. The movie has some scenes of her kind of shifting out of phase and kind of grabbing the person, and they sort of vanish.
I think there's a little bit of, just because I know he's a Edgar Rice Burroughs fan and he's done there's a little bit of one of the John Carter of Mars series, which I remember starting to read because it just sounded very strange and bizarre. I can't remember which one it is. I can't remember what it's called. But it has to do with these creatures who can kind of pull themselves out of like a primordial muck and become sentient beings, and then just kind of mash together again as some kind of which did sound kind of quite good. And then I tried reading it, and it was just it's Edgar Rice Burroughs, right? But but I'm wondering if there's a bit of that in there. I mean, there's there's probably bits of so many things that we don't know about, right? But
and so she basically wants, and so this is one area where the book and the movie differ. So they do a raid in his house, and he is asked, why are you doing this? Why are you helping us? Why are you raiding your own home? Because his brother lives there now, and his sister. Yeah. And it kind of becomes clear that his brother is sort of holding that his interest in his sister is not entirely brotherly, and then that he wants to sort of rescue her from the brother who has her in a doped up state. She's constantly, so his brother's name is Frank Cornelius, the sister's name is Catherine, and so this is one area where it differs is he actually brings together a whole bunch of kind of South African mercenaries in order to raid the house, as well as the couple of kind of old folks and Miss Brunner, and they get to the house. In the movie, it's awesome because somebody brings up the point that, like, we're all a bunch of doddering old men. Why didn't we hire some mercenaries? Which is a weird nod to the movie, and you're like, yeah, that would have made more sense.
The film's very playful, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Yeah. But the house itself is this weird fun house kind of where there's all of these defenses that are like the hallucinamats, which somehow use kind of visual stuff to disorient you and kind of make you go mad. There's also LSD gases and various other things to kind of, screw up the people trying to get in. And then there's also a bunch of kind of, I don't remember if they're in the movie, but there's a bunch of kind of like German guards as well. Kind of these stormtrooper guys running around so that whole part's quite action-filled and quite fun.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to stop you there for a minute as well, just to illustrate how this is a really good example of what's problematic with Michael Moorcock, I think, is it's not just, oh, this is rubbish, throw it away, I'm not interested. It's that you have these kind of extended set pieces, which are really good fun and full of really great ideas, and that's what makes the rest of it so frustrating, right? Is that it? He can do this, like, when he wants to, or, he can really deliver something quite, unique, right? No one else is writing stuff quite like this. And then, he's lost it. again.
Mm-hmm.
It's like listening to a mumbling stoner who becomes an incredible poet, like, once every 24 hours or something.
Moments of lucidity.
Yeah, and you're like, oh, I don't want to miss that stuff because it's really good, and but I have that, so you have to wade through all this other crap to get to it.
Mm-hmm. And so there is a part earlier as well where he meets this guy called Shades, who's apparently an assassin who has recently, he's the guy who supposedly killed JFK, and he's also possibly either killed the Queen or been involved in somehow in her having to abdicate. And I noticed in the movie, he's not really, there's no point to him being there because he doesn't do anything. I mean, he barely does anything in the novel, but it's a funny thing that it shows, oh yeah, we're going to have this character in the movie. But he's played by, and I don't know who the actor is, but I recognize the face immediately because he plays Tote, the little Nazi character from Raiders of the Lost Ark who gets the thing burnt into his hand.
Oh, not the main...
kind of baby-faced little guy.
Yeah, Dr. Jones. What's his name? Lacey.
Is that, yeah, it's funny because, like, I don't remember, I'm sure he's been in lots of stuff, but I don't remember him from anything other than these two movies.
yeah, he's, but I'm blanking on the name as well now. It's something Lacey. No, he's a pretty famous dude. What is it? Okay. Ronald Lacey is his name? Hang on. I'm on the IMDb here looking up Raiders of the Lost Ark. Yeah, here we go. Ronald Lacey.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, he shows up. He shows up playing Shades, a character who, again, is barely a character in the book and then becomes even less in the movie. But he's the one he's trying to buy napalm off of to do the raid on the house. Anyway,
who was in a few episodes of Jason King as well.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, just looking through his yeah.
So the raid kind of goes wrong. And this is a piece that's lifted right out of Elric, basically. So in the very first Elric story, Elric goes back to kind of his kingdom. His kingdom's being usurped by his cousin, who is also keeping the cousin's sister. So basically, also then Elric's cousin, he's keeping her prisoner in this tower, and Elric is into his cousin, and so he shows up, tries to rescue her, and in the course of trying to rescue her, accidentally kills her.
Interesting slip there. I think you meant Cornelius.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you meant Elric.
Yeah.
Oh.
This is a wholesale scene lifted right out of Elric and plunked down into.
But is he called Elric?
He's called Elric.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's been a while since I read the first book a while ago. So.
Right.
Oh, Elric actually does turn up. Our version of Elric does turn up in this book, then.
Oh, sorry, no, sorry. Actually, no. Sorry, what I was saying was, that happens in Elric. Elric kills his cousin accidentally while attempting to rescue her from his other cousin.
That may have been my fault, being temporarily distracted by the filmography of Ronald Lacey.
Okay, sure.
Sorry.
So basically, this is one of these cases where there are analogs for Cornelius and Elric. Basically, are the same character. Catherine and Elric's cousin, female cousin who he kills, is the same character. Elric's other cousin, the male cousin, is basically the same as Frank. And then Stormbringer, which is this cursed sword that Elric has, that kind of sucks souls, right, is Miss Brunner.
Okay. Sorry, this is no reflection on you. I think this is more to do with individuals, like, patience for this kind of thing. Like,
for sure.
Like I'm glazing over. Like, I'm like,
so why don't we say this? I think that it was genius that Michael Moorcock at some point had this realization that he created a thing called the multiverse, which allowed him to do two things. It allowed him to reuse the same 4 ideas over and over and over again, just changing the characters' names, and also to constantly refer to his other characters in his, like, he's constantly so Elric does in fact show up very briefly in the 3rd book as an albino with an attitude problem at a party, and so he creates this thing where, like, because he's written so much stuff, billions of books it seems, and there's multiple comic book versions that he's kind of involved in, kind of not. That it's like, well, either you read none of them or you read all of them, because you're chasing the dragon, you're chasing the dragon. Well, if I just read one more, maybe then it'll all come together in this jigsaw. But oh yes, he's a genius. So from a marketing perspective,
the multiverse thing seems to have started quite early on as well, right? Like early 60s.
Yes.
He did get the idea from another writer, I forget his name now. But he seems to have really taken it and run with it.
To the point where he obviously is considered to own it so much so that DC Comics paid him for the rights to use the word multiverse, and also got him to write a book for them, basically explaining how it all works and how it would work in their whatever canon, I guess.
Was he doing it before? I mean, it's a slightly different thing, but was he doing it before Jose Philip Farmer was kind of chucking all these different characters into his own kind of... He doesn't call it a multiverse, he calls it something else, right? But it's a sort of similar concept.
But it goes back at least to basically 61 with Moorcock, so I'm not sure when Farmer's dates are. But yeah, and the other thing I'll give him this too. So when he first came up with this Jerry Cornelius character, these were stories, again, written in New Worlds, right? So he comes up with the character, he writes that first kind of, I guess what it becomes more or less the book, the first book. And then he does that thing that Lovecraft did, where he says, use the character, and he gives it basically, he kind of makes it an anti-copyright thing. And so apparently multiple other Jerry Cornelius stories ran around the same time, written by other writers.
Yes.
And then he kind of took the character back at a certain point. It was like, now I'm gonna work with it.
Yeah, it became like an open world thing, right? Like you could do what you wanted with the Jerry Cornelius character, and that did play out in the pages of New World,
which,
as far as I know,
is a kind of a genius move. Like my wife has brought this up before. She says, really, if you want your work to last the test of time, and she was kind of thinking about mythologies, you need to let other people play in your sandbox.
Yes, the diversity is necessary, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and you need to have other people tell your stories, and that you need to let them add to them or change them as they need, as the cultural needs of wherever the stories go.
Right.
But if you hoard your creations, I guess that's why, like, the modern myths of our time, they really are comic books. Like, bazillions of people have written for Batman over the last 70 years, and people keep coming back and telling that story over and over again. Every 2 years, I have to see, I don't see them, but I know of another Batman movie where I'm gonna.
And that's why, of course, Nigel Farage is not known for his science fiction work. Because he doesn't like he doesn't like diversity and sharing, does he?
Yes, no, exactly.
The UKIP cinematic universe never really took off.
Yes. Yes, that would be awesome. Somebody should do that. But anyhow, so to kind of cut a long story short, basically that first book ends with Jerry Cornelius up in Lapland with this woman, vampire thing. And they become a new life form, a hermaphroditic angel demon thing, and they lay waste to the world.
It's a very tasty world. It's a very tasty world, Nick.
Yes. It's again, I was surprised that the movie went along with it. Like, I really thought, if anything, they would have been like, that ending's got to go.
The ending's great in the film. Like you said, almost better. I think just because it's able to kind of make a little bit of sense, you've got some visual icons to grab onto there, and in fact I think I saw the film, read the book, then saw the film, and I think it might help if you've actually seen the film first.
I think so too. Yeah. Absolutely. Or both. I mean, I did both. I felt that I got more out of both. And I did the opposite. I read the book first and then I watched the movie, but I felt like I got more out of both experiences. And coming back to the books, because I'll tell you, one of the reasons is because John Finch is far more entertaining as Jerry Cornelius than the Jerry Cornelius of the book is.
Yes, yes. Well, it's to be fair, it's a lot more simplistic in a way than the Jerry Cornelius of the books seems to change from book to book anyway. And in one book, he's just he's just, I don't even know what he is. He's like some sort of, is he unconscious or semi-dead or in a coffin,
in a coffin
or something?
The entire kind of screaming to himself.
And at the times, he, like you said in this first book, he's that kind of great at everything, Buckaroo Banzai kind of thing, rock star neurosurgeon or whatever the fuck.
Yeah.
And then in the other ones, he's just kind of a bit pathetic and crap and doesn't even use any powers that he might have, and is just kind of lusting after his sister. A very ineffectual character, which is not necessarily... I don't have a problem with that if the books were more, well written, or what I think is well written, or whatever, my own, literary prejudice. But the film version is very much more kind of a slightly dynamic hipster Ladbroke Grove camp, Jason King, Ken Russell kind of.
Yes,
yeah.
And the writer-director is the Avengers.
Robert Fust.
Yeah, and also the Dr. Phibes movies.
Yes,
right?
and they're very Dr. Phibes. I was thinking of Dr. Phibes specifically during the raid on the house sequence, all the booby traps as well. He was definitely the right guy to direct it, I think. But he's definitely made, and I think this cleverly so, he's made a slightly stripped down, simplified, slightly more coherent comic book version of the book, which I think is probably the only way to go, really. And it's definitely I think it's a cult film. I think it's a fun film that people should watch. I think I really enjoyed it.
It might be the best. Well, it probably is the best thing to come out of all of this.
Well, I mean, what I was
Jerry
going to
Cornelius related stuff.
Yes, I would agree with you. I'd go back and watch the film before I go. But then again, having said that, I think if the final program stood alone, which obviously is never going to happen, anything written by Michael Moorcock, but if it just stood alone and that was it, I can kind of see it as a slightly dated but fascinating beardo old, hippie era paperback.
Yes.
Like that makes sense to me. Just pluck it out, nothing else around it. But as we're going to get to now, I suppose, unfortunately, it's just the first drips from the faucet, isn't it?
But I was going to say, so because of John Finch, because I could kind of bring him to the page, like when I read the third book.
Yes.
Although not that Jerry's in it that much, which is actually a benefit to the third book from my perspective, because this is a thing where, Elric is even more famously kind of apathetic and kind of, he's a junkie, kind of like, who is just like, if your hero's constant response to everything is like, fine. It's not propulsive. You know what I mean? It's like,
I don't know. I mean, there's something to be said for the reluctant kind of. I mean, it works. Obviously, he's a lot more dynamic than Jerry Cornelius in those books. But for instance, that's what Bruce Willis's John McClane is in the Die Hard films. Right? Like, he doesn't want to be doing any of that. It's like, for fuck's sake, I have to do this now, kind of thing.
Sure, but there's a mopey. But he's not mopey. There's a tremendous
mopiness. That's true.
To Jerry to some degree, and definitely to Elric and a lot of Moorcock's other nominal heroes. They tend to be very introspective and navel gazing.
I think if you were going to film the other ones, who comes to mind? Because you need someone kind of bean thin as well and kind of a bit floppy. Would be Ben Whishaw, the new Q in the James Bond films, and a very good actor. Okay, and he was in was he Richard the third in the Hollow Crown series based on Shakespeare plays as well. I think he was he was Richard III in, I don't know if you ever saw it, but it was very good as well. And nothing, okay. I'm not having a go at him, but I'm just saying he kind of fits the what I imagine. Plus, he can fit into tight leather trousers, right? So, which I think is necessary for Jerry Cornelius.
Well, it's funny. John Finch reminded me a little bit of some sort of like, because he was the only other place I've ever seen him. When I was a kid, they made me watch the Roman Polanski version of Macbeth at school. I think I was in grade 11.
Very good in it as well. Very good.
Yeah. But I was like, so that's the only other context I have for John Finch. But apparently,
he's in Frenzy as well, the Alfred Hitchcock
film.
Oh
yes, of course, yeah. In this movie, he really kind of has this quasi. There's elements of kind of the swagger of Jim Morrison in there. There's elements of like young Lovejoy, Ian McShane,
right.
The intensity, and elements of young Tim Curry as well. But better looking than any of these people. Like he's quite a handsome guy.
Yeah.
I was impressed with him and kind of surprised that he didn't seem to have had much more of a. Except I guess all these movies bombed except for Frenzy, so that may have been why he may have had a kind of a flash in the pan. But I don't think at the time they were box office successes. Any of the other things he did.
Yeah, interesting guy. If you want to read more about. John Finch, actually, he was interviewed in an issue of Shock Cinema magazine many years ago. It's a pretty good interview, yeah. Other thing worth mentioning about the Polanski Macbeth as well, that people might have forgotten, also with a young Keith Chegwin in it.
Cheggers,
yes. He doesn't play pop in Macbeth.
And then the other thing that this is just a last piece of apocrypha before we get on to having to deal with these other books, which maybe we'll do in a short and quick and kind of like a
I was hoping you would say that.
Yeah, but I love this. Apparently, because I think I'm more interested in talking about the movie, the final program, than I am in talking about any of these books.
Yes.
But when it was released as a double bill. And the second part of the double bill was Shaw Brothers' Intimate Confessions of a Chinese Courtesan.
Ah, okay. Good film.
Which is, that's an interesting double bill. And apparently, according to Moorcock, after 2 weeks, they flipped it. And they put Final Program on the end of the show. They were like, it's...
Right, that makes sense.
Let's move up the Chinese booby movie because more punters are going to be willing to...
By the way, Chinese booby movie sounds like a podcast title to me. I'd be willing to co-host the Chinese booby movie podcast.
Okay, alrighty. Well, yes. Well, we're getting towards Michael Moorcock levels of, spreading ourselves too thin.
Yes.
Guesting in 7 different other, Yeah,
it's a shame. It's a shame final program's actually, relatively easy to see now. Otherwise, those losers over at Film Crack would talk about it.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
A couple of twats they are. So there's
anyway.
There's
3 more of these books.
Yes, actually I was surprised there's actually even more, right? Because there's I have these 4: the final program, A Cure for Cancer, The English Assassin, The Condition of Muzak, as the Cornelius Quartet, but it was also known as the Cornelius Collection or something like that, and it was volume 1. There's like at least another 2 volumes, which I'm guessing is short stories and
possibly a couple of novels that came later on.
Right. Yeah. I'm not going anywhere near that.
Although it's one of them.
Right.
That interests me quite a bit. So I guess in 1981 or thereabouts, somehow for some reason, some publisher came to Michael Moorcock and said, "We want you to write the novelization of The Great Rock and Roll Swindle."
Now that is a kind of interesting.
Yeah. And so Moorcock
I did notice the name Great Rock and Roll Swindle, but I did not. I assumed it was a coincidence or just a reference or something. Oh, okay.
No, apparently he, being in typical Moorcock fashion, wrote his own characters into it. So Jerry Cornelius is a character in the book of the film.
Michael, stop it!
Yeah, but I'm kind of interested because apparently it was originally published on newsprint.
Annoyingly, I'm interested as well now, you fuck.
Sorry, because apparently it's very hard to find.
Okay.
And it was handed out for free to punters who went to see The Great Rock and Roll Swindle in the cinemas.
Oh, okay.
And then later on it was kind of put out as a limited edition paperback at some point a bit later on. But supposedly it's quite anti, what's his face, the twat, their manager, Malcolm McLaren.
Malcolm McLaren.
Yeah,
it's funny. I immediately knew who you were talking about. You didn't have to add the manager.
Yeah, supposedly his take on it was much more of a Sex Pistols friendly and less friendly to the act, because the movie itself, obviously, famously, is from the point of view of.
Right. Although I have to say, I haven't seen The Great Rock and Roll Swindle in a very, very long time, indeed, and I think now would be an interesting time to see it, because I think when I first saw it, I wasn't necessarily that clued into, how much animosity was between management and the band. And then the next time I would have seen it would have been post seeing that documentary, The Filth and the Fury, and I would have been very much on the Pistols.
Yes, yeah.
And
but
now
that was Jamie Reed's apology, because he'd made both films. Right? Yeah.
Julian Temple.
Sorry, Julian Temple. Yeah. So Jamie Reed is the artist.
Yeah. And then so now I'm just thinking, kind of with the benefit of whatever small amount of whatever passes for wisdom I've accrued over the years, and now that everyone's, Johnny Rotten's acting like a bit of a dick nowadays as well, and I'm just wondering if now Great Rock and Roll Swindle would be a very interesting watch from a extremely neutral position. Like, I wonder if I would find it even more fascinating now, potentially.
Yes, yeah, and we're going to get to this whole question of well, we're not, but those guys over at Film Crack are going to get to talking about, those knobs. But they're going to get to talking about situationism, and there is obviously a direct connection there to Malcolm McLaren and Jamie Reed and that whole.
Right.
But anyway,
fuckers they are, as well.
Yes, hideous. They should really have paper bags on
bags on their heads. Yeah. Not like us, handsome devils.
Yes, well, we're blessed. We're blessed.
Yes, reading makes you look better, kids. That's another.
Yeah. Don't watch movies. You'll end up with a squinty little, prick. But yeah. Anyway, so that's to me. But you know what? But that's the Moorcock come on. It's that thing of like, oh, maybe this sounds interesting. No, it's not. Right.
Yeah. Bang on.
It's going to be another letdown.
Yeah, and I'll probably get tricked again as well. Like, well, now I've written that down for a start as a note. I wrote The Great Rock and Roll. I'll probably try and see if I can find a copy of that. So on to second, and the only thing I wanted to say to differentiate them is, so I just wanted to talk about my reading experience with. So I read the first one and thought, oh yeah, okay, yeah, it wasn't quite as awesome as I was expecting from the film. Not that the film's awesome, but I thought, well, if the film's like this, then the book kind of must be like this, and it wasn't. It was more like over here somewhere, but worth a read. So okay, good. Cure for Cancer, here we go. And within less than 10 pages, I think. Well, probably because the first 10 pages was just, blah! I mean, there's literally pages in the second one, which is just noises. And in total non sequiturs, right? I was like, what the fuck is this? I mean, I don't think, there's very few books I read which just literally are pushing you away from the page. Like, you don't read this, I'm going to make this difficult to read. And it was such an alienating experience that when you actually, because I think initially this started with, should we do the Jerry Cornelius books? And I said, well, I don't like to reread so much. I've read the first one. Do you mind if we go on to the second one? And you said, great. And because I don't think you'd read any of them, right?
No.
Right? So, and I enthusiastically said, great. And because the book had so totally alienated me, I had forgotten I had even tried to read it. Until I went to my Cornelius Quartet book. Because I was always wondering as well, like, it had obviously, I'd had such a bad experience. Like, this book wasn't even on my shelf. It was like in the back of a cupboard. Like, with other books on top of it and covered in dust, like, you know, maybe some turds and other things. And I was wondering, oh, I wonder why I treated that book so badly. It's, you know, and I totally forgotten. I dug it out. And I found the bookmark between books 2 and 3, the other 1 and 2. Did I? No. And then I flicked back, and it all came rushing back. Oh no, this fucking So that's my experience of the second book.
Okay.
And I just wanted to say that the third book was kind of more the same, but at a slightly lower dosage.
Okay.
And I kind of gave up on that. And then, getting to the fourth one, The Condition of Music, because the fourth book, it at least kind of reads like a relatively standard narrative, and we don't jump from character to character, that we actually stick with Jerry for at least the first quarter of the book.
Okay.
Managed to trick me into thinking, I'm enjoying this because it's not actively horrible. And then after I'd kind of climatized, about a quarter of the way through, I was like, oh, this isn't very good either. But at least it's not as horrible as experience as. So other than that kind of shape of the reading, they're all part of the same kind of melange, and I have very little to say about them. So the floor is kind of yours for the sequels.
Sure. Maybe, as I said, I haven't read the second one. I've read the third one. I haven't read the fourth one. So it's funny.
Sorry, overall, you didn't read the second one.
No, I haven't. No.
Why? Was there a reason you skipped the second one onto the third one?
Yep. The secondhand bookshop where initially I bought the first one.
Yeah.
I went back there about a week ago to buy the second one, and it's the only one of the three.
Oh, okay.
I didn't have it. Somebody else had bought it, so good luck to them.
Yes. Yeah.
Starting with the second book.
When you're walking around the streets of if you see someone kind of like weeping with a book in their hand or contemplating jumping under a bus or something, that might be your man or woman.
Right. Especially if they actually thought it did include a cure for cancer in it. That would be, I would imagine, particularly disappointing.
They thought they found gold in the second-hand book. What's this now? I never heard of this.
But yeah, so it's funny. You know, there are things like I quite liked that Jerry was off the page for most of the book because I was bored of him.
This is the third book now.
Yeah, third book. This is the one where he spends the entire book kind of having retreated into some sort of comatose, screaming, caterwauling state where he's locked in a coffin the entire novel. So that I liked, funnily enough. I liked spending time with some of the other characters, particularly his mother, who isn't in the first book. And again, it's not clear to me if this is the same Jerry Cornelius anyway from the first book, because it seems to me as though it can't be, because his sister's still alive and his brother's still alive. There's a bunch of things that don't really add up. It doesn't seem like it could be set before. I mean, maybe it could be set before the first book. I don't know, but it's not clear.
Don't give a shit.
I just took it as being like one of a number of parallel,
right?
So, you know,
his mother's
stories or whatever.
His mother's like uber cockney, isn't she? She's like,
she's
cool,
fantastic.
fucking blimey, governor. Like,
yeah, she's great, and she's like really bawdy and kind of rude and funny, and just seems to have far more life than any of the other characters in the story.
It is worth mentioning as well, because I did a bit of a hatchet job. I should reiterate again the most annoying thing. The reason that these things are so annoying is that they're not 100%. So, yeah, there are bits that are actually really, really good. There's like a there's a part. Is it at the beginning of the third one? And I never got to the end of it, so I don't actually know if this is the case or even if they confirm it. But isn't Jerry Cornelius's character basically first discovered in like a cave at the beach?
Yes.
In some kind of pod or torpedo tube or
Yep.
something that is just washed up there, and then some character, I can't remember if it's Bruno or someone else, smells him, sniffs him out, goes to the cave and opens up. That whole thing, when the set piece in the cave is great. I really liked that. I thought it was fun and it was intriguing and it piqued my interest. And then it just turns to shit. Like, it's remarkable. It's like, it's not just that he can't write. It's he can write and then deliberately doesn't, or I don't know what the fuck he's doing the rest of the time.
I mean, I suppose having read Burroughs and some of that stuff, the kind of the cut-ups, and this one, because that one is really, it's kind of a war book. It seems to kind of follow these characters across these various kind of war scenes, and there's some of it. I mean, there was one part I really liked was there's a whole bit about where Colonel, I think there's two different colonels or two different military guys who I was mixing up as the story went on. But anyway, one of them goes to Scotland, where there's a bunch of anarchist Highlanders who are kind of involved in a battle against Britain or against, England specifically. And that section was quite funny and weird.
Yes. But even the cut-ups, even Burroughs at his most self-indulgent and kind of narratively difficult fault, even those are much easier to read than this. I seriously, I don't know if it's because, in the case of the cut-ups, like, because, it's not, I think people misunderstand the cut-ups, right? Like, people tend to think, they just take a bunch of stuff, cut it into 4 pieces, stick it together, boom, that's it. No. You read through it and you decide what to use and what you don't use, and so there's an active kind of part of you that's trying to turn it into, which might make the difference. Like, you're almost overcompensating in a way, like trying to make it make sense. Therefore, you take more care that it actually makes sense. Honestly, those cut-ups, I can follow them. I don't have a problem reading them at all. But it just turned to bilge, and it's not as if it's just because he's just randomly putting words in. He's not just saying, my Colonel, teapot featherhead, by God. It's not that. Each thing makes sense. That sentence makes sense. The sentence that follows it makes sense in relation to the following. I'm following it, but somehow, actually, in a way, it's almost quite impressive that he manages to lose you or lose me. There's nothing attaches itself to my brain so that it works as a narrative. I don't know how you felt if you had this much problem with me.
Really, I would agree with you that maybe it's cut up in terms of like it's a bunch of chapters,
right?
But those chapters don't necessarily relate to the chapter that's gone before or after. In terms of time, in terms of the characterization, like it is very, it's very strange. So there isn't a narrative through line in that book that's in any way, followable.
The other thing I'm thinking that might have been influenced by these books, but in a very different, very tidied up way, was David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas.
Okay, which I don't think I've...
You might have seen the movie version with...
No, I don't think I've seen the movie or read the book.
And that's like a series of different... one chapter's one time period, one story, and then it circles around and, and that's a lot more like each one is a lot more self-contained. And I had problems with that, even though it's a well-written and... I read the whole thing through to the end, but then when I did finish it, it did feel a little bit like someone was like, I'd like to write a novel about, maritime adventures in the 18th century, and I'd like to, but I don't quite have enough to... I know what I'll do. I'll just write a bit of each novel and present it in this way, and then I don't even have to bother, writing it properly. Even though I did enjoy... reading it at the end, I did think, okay, that's kind of a bit of a cheat. But even that's brilliant compared to this. Even though I'm not sure, I'm sure Michael Moorcock is trying to do something. Like I don't know what you think about this. I don't have him marked down as cynical. I don't have him marked down as like, ha, I'm going to write reams of this crap, people are going to buy it. And I don't think of him in that way. I might be wrong. Maybe he's the most cynical man you've ever met. But it doesn't read that way to me. I think he thinks he's doing something. But it just doesn't work, or I don't get it.
Well, it's interesting because that last book, which I have, the one I haven't read, the Condition of Muzak, that won the 1977 Guardian.
Yeah, I know.
Like best fiction.
But everyone was on the same drugs then, see. So
Okay. But as I said, I didn't. It's funny. I didn't mind the English Assassin. I didn't.
Did you read the whole thing?
Oh yeah.
Oh
yeah. I read it in kind of 3 sittings, and it was interesting. I read the first kind of half of it in 1 sitting, and when I came back, it was very hard to get back into. It was like
right.
my mind had entered. It was like my mind had entered into a groove, but then I didn't know where to put the needle down.
Right.
You know what I mean? It took quite a lot of pages. I think I was having that experience of having that gloss, kind of where your eyes are following the words. But
right. It's like an album. It's like an album that has sides which have track marks, but it's all one continuous track.
Yes.
Getting back to Hawkwind again.
Yes, exactly. So it was, in that way, it was. I get it. I get what you're saying. So but I think maybe when I first sat down with it, for whatever reason, I got into its groove and I was okay.
Were you high?
Sorry?
Were you high?
No. I was sitting outside in the sun, which was nice. Maybe that was part of it. It was very relaxing.
Too much
but,
sun.
It's funny.
Maybe.
There are. I will say, there are things that I wrote down that I didn't like. Particularly were I didn't like the real life newspaper clippings. They seemed morbidly pointless to me.
Yes,
like they were all real and they were all about children getting murdered or burned or beaten to death. And I don't like, what purpose does this serve? And it got to this whole thing of like, this is again that adolescence of science fiction, that adolescence of comics. Like we have to be edgy, we have to rub the reader's face in this, and the book didn't need it,
Yeah, no, and again,
we know the world's a crap place.
That kind of, that feeds into the problem I have with it as well, I suppose, in a way, is this thing where, the shock of the new or the whatever, that stuff dates really badly, right? So there's like a book comes out and everyone's like in recent years, is it called Dead Leaves or House of Dead Leaves? That, I don't know if you read that. It came out, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago or something. And it was actually a lot like Cloud Atlas in a way. It's a very meta book. It's a book about a guy who finds this legendary old book. And the excerpts from what is supposed to be the legendary old book are actually quite well done, because it's about this house that, a bit like, I suppose they must have copied it out of the Gormenghast thing, it's a house that has these mysterious dimensions that suddenly grow and you can't measure. It's like inside the house is growing.
Okay.
And a bit of
non-Euclidean
TARDIS, yes,
as our friend Lovecraft used to say.
Yeah, so there's that in it, and that's actually quite good, even though you feel as if, okay, you're pastiching another thing, but fair play, you're pastiching it quite well. And if it was just this, I would probably read it. But then, of course, it takes a chapter break, and then it goes back to the guy who's discovered this book, and it's all very fucking David Foster Wallace, and
right.
And the book's like 1,000 pages long, and then all of a sudden, some of the text is written sideways or upside down or in different colours, and it's that kind of thing. Can you imagine back in the 60s or something, someone had, wrote that, and you were, wow, man, this is like far out, like, this chapter is written like backwards, woo. But you don't even have to get to now, like 5 years later, 10 years later, but now you just think, fucking hell, this is fucking annoying. Like, I see what you've done there, but other than that initial shock tactics, or this is it doesn't last, right? It's just immediately becomes garbage.
So in this way, I want to give Michael Moorcock the benefit of the doubt, because I'm not sure what he's been doing for the last 30 or 40 years. But I would say, Alan Moore kind of went on a bit of an apology tour after a while. Basically, he said, when he started doing comics, and particularly things like, Miracle Man or, The Killing Joke, Watchmen, and stuff like that, there was this feeling of like, let's make comics for adults. But that's not necessarily, like, the idea that, like, sex, drugs, and violence are the only ways to write for adults.
Equals adults.
Is a very adolescent way of thinking.
Yes.
And he sort of said that, like, he felt like he pushed comics into this, he pushed them out of shape, basically. He said, like, he was looking back then saying, actually, the comics of the 50s and 60s were much more interesting than what he had done, and then what ultimately came out of, because he basically set the tone for the next 20 years of comics. Where it all got grimdark and but in this very teenage way. And then, so he kind of, his own mea culpa, he then did Supreme and Tom Strong, which were kind of his versions, and then the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen as well. So were his versions of looking back then. And so I would like to know, like, did Moorcock ever outgrow this style, or these kinds of characters, these kind of stories? And another thing that it's like, this is I put this in my like, I don't know if this is in your good or bad column, because on the one hand, Moorcock deserves a nod for having basically invented steampunk, but at the same time, he basically invented steampunk.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. No, steampunk is a classic example of one of those things which is like, that was really cool if it had remained, one book or one series of books or one films or something. But then at this point, you're like, if I see another fucking pair of goggles on a guy in a trench coat in a steam powered spaceship, I'm gonna punch someone. And even though it can be done, obviously there's always someone who can do it well. I mean, I'm thinking the film Steam Boy, actually, and and that's quite far along in the continuum, but it's good for it's done well. And Miyazaki Hayato's early stuff often had a kind of a steampunk ethic, and kind of which is all good as well. But basically the Oswald Bastable books, which are late 60s, early 70s, that is really the first time, as far as I know. And again, he was looking back to those Edwardian, those John Carter of Mars kinds of things, and then steampunk before it was steampunk, as it were. Like, it's the OG kind of while we were doing this, it's just we didn't retroactively, ironically call it something. We just did it, It's the difference between a proper drive-in film and, Grindhouse.
But so I guess maybe I'll just finish up by saying one of the other things that frustrated me about the Elric books when I first read them was that they clearly were. And again, this is one thing in watching the interviews with him. He really was a writer Moorcock was a writer who wrote to deadlines for money. He's very clear about that, he was a working writer, he had 2 kids to feed, and so there's an element sometimes with those things where they feel like, and Harry Harrison's, some of his work suffers from the same, this feeling of like just headlong creative, which is, it's impressive, to be able to produce that much work in a short space of time. But a feeling of like, he didn't have any idea where he was going. And the stories sometimes have this very meandering, made up as they went along feeling about them. And that can be unsatisfying if you're used to things more tightly plotted, have the expectation, particularly with, I think, fantasy and science fiction, where there's often a feeling that the author should have an end game in sight when they begin.
The other thing that's strange about Michael Moorcock, and I don't know if I'm right about this, I might be wrong, but my impression is he wasn't just this kind of critic's darling whose stuff quickly dated. I get the feeling he was actually a pretty well-selling author as well, right? Like, you would have found his paperbacks in the back pockets of all sorts of people. He was a fairly good-selling author, right? It wasn't just a kind. Obviously, there's a cult around him, but it wasn't just. I mean, you would find if you trawled, old 70s living rooms of a kind of cross section of people who read science fiction and fantasy, you would probably, I don't think that Michael Moorcock would be a rare Michael. I think a lot of people would have had Moorcock on their shelves or on their sofas or next to their bed or whatever.
Yeah, I think so. And the other thing too is he was one of the first people to really see comics as a viable. Like he was a print writer, but who also was like, comics are another way to express some of my ideas. And again, in that way of kind of disseminating his characters widely in comic books from very early on. And I think part of that comes back to that New Worlds. I think he often wrote the script idea or just told the artist, I want you to, there was almost in that comic booky way of, say, like a Stan Lee who would just write the idea and then Jack Kirby would go do the breakdowns and then he would kind of impose a story back onto, it was a very kind of fluid give and take. I mean, Moorcock does talk about how he did have that kind of relationship with artists right back to the beginning.
Well, riddle me this then, Nick. Imagine an alternative world where the Cornelius Quartet are actually comics. That kind of makes a little bit more sense, right? Because you have a visual thing pulling you through it, I think. Like, it would still, imagine it's still random, it still switches from page to page, from chapter to chapter. But if you've got something to kind of look at, I can kind of see how these would work better as
drawn by, either Brian Talbot or Kevin O'Neill or something like that as well.
Right.
One of those. And speaking of actually, so Brian Talbot's one, like his Luther Arkwright graphic novel, kind of his underground thing that he did for a long time, is apparently very more cocky,
I've not read
nods
that.
towards a lot of this stuff.
Right.
It might be something just to think about for a different comics related
another fucking
show.
Jesus Christ. I think YouTube's had enough of us by now.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Yes, be warned. Be warned. There may be another sister podcast to Literary as Feck launching sometime soon to do with comics. But we're still kind of wrestling with the pronunciation of the possible title. So anyway,
we'll get there.
Stay tuned.
But I don't really have anything else to say except that I probably will read The Condition of Muzak, just because it seems weird to me to have read half of a quadrilogy or whatever you call a tetralogy, whatever this 4-volume series is.
Quartet.
Quartet. Yeah, there we go. That'll work.
I think quadrilogy, as far as I know, was made up by the people who released the Alien box set right back in the in the late 90s. I don't think it's actually a word, right?
That's where I know that word
that's
from.
where everyone knows that word from. The quadrilogy, where did I pick that up from? It's that fucking Alien box set. That's what it is.
Awesome. So I have nothing else to say except that except that I always want Michael Moorcock to be better than he seems to be. At least in terms of this. I do love the music. I like some of the comics. I did like the Hawkwind book, but generally speaking, it's never as good as I think he should be or that I want him to be.
But like you said, we're not exactly that au fait with his later stuff, and he could have, like you said, if you're going to use the Alan Moore analogy, for example, I mean, I think probably the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen might be the best thing he ever did, right? So there could be a really great, maybe Mother London. That's the one that maybe we might want to try tackling that one day. As for the Cornelius Quartet, I'm taking the opposite approach. It's going back in the cupboard with the turds, and I hope no one else reminds me about it. And then I have another brain wipe, and I'm like, "Oh yeah, Jerry, cool," and I pick it out and then get annoyed again. So, yeah.
Well, that's great because it kind of narratively connects to that third book where Jerry Cornelius is literally in a cave at the bank or somewhere for the entire story. So
yeah,
you
where
can put him
he
back in his cave.
fucking belongs. Anyway,
movie's good though. Movie's good.
Yes.
Maybe that's our takeaway.
Check out the final program. It's a lot of fun. Right. Okay. I guess we're done then.